Welcome to the July 2013 Dallas Camera Club Print Competition. Our topic this month is open. Our judge this month is Paul Sokal. Paul has been a photographer for nearly 50 years. His first camera was a 35mm Voigtlander rangefinder. He then moved on to a Nikon SLR. As a kid, while his friends were out raising hell, he was huddling under the safe light in his basement darkroom. In 2004, he bought his first digital SLR and has been shooting digital ever since. While Paul will shoot anything, including weddings, which he did for several years, he really considers urban landscape his wheelhouse. In addition to judging previously for Dallas Camera Club, this will be Paul's third year as a judge for the State Fair of Texas. Paul considers himself fortunate to be exhibited in galleries in Dallas and Austin, as well as the Center for Fine Art Photography in Colorado. He has sold prints for commercial installations and private collections, and has been honored to win a number of awards, including the grand prize in the First Trinity River Photography Contest. Beginner's Monochrome Prints. Allies by Barbara Briley. As a history buff, I find the subject of this image interesting. I suspect many viewers would not. This looks like it was shot at a World War museum. The challenge is to make a scene look like that, or to bring in more elements to add interest, such as some children studying the exhibit. The print itself is very flat and dark. I'm not sure if this was intended, or poor printing technique and bad paper choice. 8 points. The Fab Foreign Friend, Stoned in Houston, by Chris Kobos. The scene is well framed. The problem when photographing a work of art is you can't just take a picture of it and think you've created a piece of art yourself. You must interpret the sculpture in this case in a unique way that is more than the view any passerby would see. Also, this print is very flat, low contrast. Even on the metallic paper it looks dead. 8 points. Rocky Waters by Michael Farnham. There are a lot of good aspects to this image. Tonality, contrast, nicely blurred water. The problem is the composition. The viewer's eye just wanders around without focus. The large rock on the left side of the image needs some negative space around it to isolate it more and make it the focus. As it is, it just seems to be cutting off the left side of the image. The opposite bank is a narrow strip. It seems like a mistake. Either it should have been increased or cropped out. 8 points. Tears of Joy by Spencer Parker. A great emotional moment has been captured. There is severe blurring of the image. Adjusting the technique to create a sharp image would have made this a winner. 8 points and honorable mention. Solid Hand by Dalis and Foglia. When photographing a work of art, you can record it, say for a book or a personal travel album, or you can try to interpret the work of art through your eyes. I think the photographer made a good effort at the latter, highlighting the hand in this sculpture. The hand is a bit blurred. Were it not, there would be better separation. Also, darkening the corners would draw the viewer's eyes in on the subject. 10 points and third place. Bench in the Park by Julie Horak. I like the image because it took a mundane subject, a bench, and gave us an interesting perspective on it. The image has good contrast and tonal range. It would be interesting to see a more abstract version, closer to the bench with a shallower depth of field. 12 points and second place. Lost Souls by Penny Clark. This image got first place for the creative effort and the story it tells, a concept well executed. The tree in the background doesn't really add to the image for me, but is more of a distraction. However, the photographer minimized that with the narrow depth of field. 13 points and first place. Advanced Monochrome Prints. Relic of the Railroad by Gary Coles. The subject is interesting with a variety of textures and surfaces to study. The sky in the upper left adds nothing, and the branches along the left side need to be cropped out. Shoot this tighter and it becomes all the more interesting and mysterious. The downgrade is due to serious over-sharpening and digital artifacting as a result. 8 points. War Eagle Mill by Jerry Martin. The overall composition and the light in this scene are strong. The reason I downgraded this image is because the print has a series of scratches across it that appear to be from the print head. This may be an issue with printer settings for paper thickness. Only submit your best prints. 8 points. Play at the Beach by Susan Stageman. Generally well composed. The biggest issue for me is the girl's eyes are closed, or she's looking down so much we don't see them. If this is Play at the Beach, I want to see sparkling eyes and a smile. Also, the processing is very flat. I'd like to see more contrast and tonal range. 8 points. See No Evil by Steve Havachek. The subject matter and use of depth of field are good. To me, the biggest problem is that the detail in See No Evil is hard to pick out, and when I first looked at the image, it looked like a blob. The detail in Hear No Evil is much clearer, I think, in part because the light seems more directional. I think moving to the side, separating the three monkeys a bit, would have made a more dynamic composition and possibly brought out more detail in See No Evil. 9 points. School's Out by Andy McCulloch. This is a really fun shot, and I'm sure the girls love it. What's holding this image back is that the subject is just too soft. Also, the highlights are blown out. 10 points. Take Me Home by Richard Stern. Who doesn't love an adorable kitten? Slight change of your shooting position could have centered the kitten in the bars, and I wish his eyes were a little sharper. 10 points. Stripped by Susan Burciaga. The subject matter and the story it tells are strong. The story would be even more compelling with more context. I think a wider view showing the feet of the people walking by the bike frame. Imagine a picture of a beggar, then imagine a picture of a beggar being ignored by the people hustling by him. Which is more interesting? 10 points. Train Detail Number 11 by Tina Arms. The subject and its textures draw you in to try to figure out what this is. It is a little soft. Did you shoot this with a tripod? With the mirror up? I also think the composition could use a little more headroom. It looks crowded at the top. Overall, the image is flat, and I'd like to see you increase the clarity and contrast. I wonder how it would have looked lit by an off-camera flash across the surface instead of the flat ambient light. 11 points and honorable mention. Lines and Grains in a Woodpile by Janie Rumberger. Interesting image, not a subject frequently photographed in my experience. The highlights look a little blown to me, so I'd pull them back a bit. You are shooting raw, right? 11 points and 3rd place. Summer Breeze by Rachel Cook. Overall, I think the composition works well. I like where the subject is placed in the frame, the pose, and that her face is in focus. Overall, a compelling portrait. In general, the rule is that the horizon shouldn't go through the subject's head. Of course, the rules are made to be broken, and in this case, it doesn't bother me that much. Might be interesting, though, to have shot her from a higher vantage point, which would have the added benefit of opening her eyes some more. The other thing I would like is to rotate her slightly to the right. I think this would get more light in her eyes and less shadow from her hair. In a perfect world, I'd like those stray hairs out of her eyes too. 11 points and 2nd place. Hard Target by Bob Kraus. Unique subject and composition, very graphical quality, and even though this is the monochrome division, I like the little bit of color on the darts. I wish there was a little more room between the target and the middle dart shadow. The print I have for review has a lot of marks on it and what could be some tiny droplets from your printer. Only submit your best prints. This one looks like it's been abused a bit. 13 points and 1st place. Masters Monochrome Prints. Oak Tree by Kay Hargis. Well exposed and focused. This image really needs a subject. It seems to be just a jumble of branches and leaves, a background awaiting the landing of an exotic bird, perhaps. Maybe there was some unusual knot or scar on the tree that could have focused the viewer's attention. 8 points. Resting Outdoors in Agra, India by Rumberger. I think this image needs some context to pull in the viewer. The bush in the lower right corner is a distraction which it looks like the photographer tried to minimize with a vignette in post. Would have been better to reposition and get it out of the frame at the time of the shot. I think a bit more tonal range would have picked up the image too. 9 points. Private Property by Suzanne Graham. The contrasting texture of the wood and the metal are good in this photo. I'd lose the plastic nail head. I think you needed more depth of field as parts of the chain look out of focus. Also, the highlights are blown out. 9 points. Sand Serene Shadows by J. Hoppenstein. The contrast and textures of the materials are good. I think a tighter shot would have been more abstract and interesting. 10 points. Sneaker Waves by Betty Johnson. The depth, contrast, and tonal range here are strong. I think this image needs a taller, more substantial wave to really succeed. 11 points. Man and Mule by Bill Hayes. The photographer did an excellent job of recreating a vintage image. The positioning of the man looking off the frame increases the interest and tension. The plow seems to be sharper than the man, though. I wish it were the other way around, but hard to achieve at the edge of the frame where lenses often go soft. 11 points. On Park Avenue by Dennis Fritchie. Great composition, and I love how the light brings out the rock's texture. I think this may be just a tad over sharpened. 11 points. Symmetry by Aaron Curry. The three tones and their arrangement are strong. This is a well-crafted image, but it just doesn't speak to me, so I really can't offer any suggestions to improve it. 11 points. Mushrooms by Waylon Threadgill. Weston does shrooms. The surface of the caps looks grainy and appears to exhibit some digital artifacts. What ISO was this shot at? 12 points. Yosemite Valley Clearing Storm by Frank Richards. A wonderful homage to Ansel Adams. Not sure this could be improved. It's a beautiful image. 12 points. Shawnee Mills by Gary Kelly. A well-composed and interesting industrial architecture subject. To me, the HDR look is a bit gimmicky. 12 points. Badwater Death Valley by Steve Newman. Beautiful landscape image. Love the reflection, the sky. I don't know if there were a foreground element that could have been added to give it some more depth. Looks like there probably wasn't. 13 points and judge's choice. Panamint Mountains Rising Over Death Valley by Bob Johnson. The image has wonderful depth with the layering of the mountains and clouds. Sign Ansel Adams' name to it. 13 points and honorable mention. The Angel Above by Dan Meredith. The tonality and use of light are strong. 14 points and third place. Looking Over Overlook by Steve Reeves. I love the tonality and light in this image. The uniqueness and the humor of the subject is engaging. Could be a tad dark. 14 points and second place. Night and Day by Houston Brown. Unique urban image, dramatic light, great technique, being sure to keep the letters correctly oriented in the flipped side of the image. 15 points and first place. Next we have Beginner's Color Prints. Paris Street Lamp. Decent composition. Moving slightly to the right would move the branches off the dome, and I think improve it. The print has a lot of technical flaws. First is the paper choice, in my opinion. It's flat and lacks any depth. The colors, especially the greens, are very blocked up. The lens used also appears to have significant chromatic aberration. This should be correctable in Photoshop. 7 points. The Archway. The title is The Archway, yet the only thing in focus is the bench, which is too dark to see, especially against the blown highlights in the background. The arch is pretty, and I think had you focused on it, you'd have a better image. I think what you really need is to shoot this at a different time of day when it is not so severely backlit. As far as the print, the contrast needs to be improved and the saturation is flat. Was that intentional? The colors are also pretty blocked up. You may have pushed the image too far in post-processing. Do you shoot raw? If not, start. 7 points. I See You by Aaron Lesher. This image has a lot of potential. The concept is great and the composition is good. That said, if you could have dropped down just a little, we could see a little more of the eyes. I don't mind losing a little nose. So in this image, you're trying to highlight the eyes of this hidden animal. You're doing that by contrasting the eyes with the blurred plants in the foreground. The problem is the eyes are not as sharp as they need to be to maximize that contrast. Also, you've got a lot of highlights competing with your subject. I think burning those in a bit and dodging the line would give you better contrast and a better image. 8 points. Sunlit Berries by Denny Farmer. The light in the image and the use of depth of field are strong. As it is, it just isn't that interesting an image for me. It might make a good background image for, say, an article in a magazine. I think cropping it would help focus the viewer. Also, the highlights are blown out. If you shoot raw, you could probably recover them. 8 points. The Organ at St. Luke's Episcopal Church by Morris Stein. Potentially interesting subject. The pipes make for an interesting graphic element. Not sure what the subject is here. The musician? The pipes? As Robert Capa said, if your pictures aren't good enough, get closer. And in this case, that wouldn't require getting shot at. 8 points. Anticipation by Jim Stump. The image is generally well composed. I think the composition would be better with a little more headroom and more room to the right. The biggest issue is that the background is so much brighter than the subject that it overwhelms the bird. I believe you could correct this in Photoshop or Lightroom. 10 points. Heron STARIN by Dalis and Foglia. Nicely composed close-up of a blue heron, albeit not too original. The background is nicely blurred, yielding great separation from the background. I think the highlights on the top of its head are blown out, and I think you could recover them if you shoot raw. 11 points. Make Way by Michael Farnham. Good capture of some nature action. Image is sharp, and I like the element of the reflection. That said, I think it would be better cropped a little bit on the right and on the bottom. 11 points and honorable mention. You Gotta Have Faith by Penny Clark. Good composition and lighting. As with the black and white version, the tree just seems to clutter the image. Her hair is lost in it. Adding the moon in focus seems contrived. I would blur it. The viewer will still know what it is. 11 points and 3rd place. Under the Pier by Julie Horak. I rated this image for its composition. It really draws your eye. Especially the left side of the image looks flat. I think you could have upped the contrast and clarity. I think the biggest improvement would be to change this to black and white. 12 points and 2nd place. MOAB Indian Cloud Face in Arch by Chris Kobos. Excellent use of color, good contrast and detail. The edges appear a bit over-sharpened. Lose the metallic paper. 13 points and 1st place. Advanced Color Prints. Could use a manicure by Bob Kraus. Good composition. Orangutan is an interesting subject. This print really suffers from the paper choice. It is flat and lifeless. This image needs contrast and dynamic range. While it may be sort of a cute moment in the life of an orangutan, it's just not that interesting. I would much rather have seen something engaging in the animal's eyes, whether primate or cat. The key is the eyes. 8 points. Beauty in the Rock by Jerry Martin. This image is well composed. I think the saturation is pushed way too far. This has blocked up some of the colors, especially the pink. It's hard for me to think the pink in the rocks is real and not a result of that. There is digital artifacting and looks like some chromatic aberration as well in the rocks. 8 points. Homeward Bound by Andy McCulloch. The light in the image and the story the image tells are good. The image looks like a composite. There is artifacting around the little girl, and the light isn't quite right. I don't do compositing, so I'm probably not the person to advise on how to improve this effect. 10 points. Ants in Your Plants by J. Hoppenstein. Well done capture of the Japanese lantern show. How is this unique? How is this any different than the shot of any visitor to the show would show with their iPhone? Try a unique perspective that the average viewer would never do. Get on the ground, get super close, try a different lens, do something to distinguish this from a snapshot. 10 points. Frosty Steam Train by Steve Havacek. Well composed, technically well executed image. Nothing special about it. Again, to quote Kappa, get closer, give us a unique view of this scene. 10 points. Before the Wedding by Susan Stageman. Fun moment for a bachelorette posse. There's nothing really wrong with this image. It would be a nice moment in a wedding album perhaps, but otherwise it has pretty limited appeal. 10 points. Kayaks by Aaron Curry. Strong use of color and perspective. I wish the rental sign weren't there. 11 points. Fertile Flower by Susan Burciaga. Lovely composition and use of depth of field. I wish the butterfly were a little sharper. Also looks like some subtle banding in the print. Might want to check your print heads. 11 points. Milady by Tina Arms. Interesting portrait, not exactly my cup of tea, but interesting. Judging from the catchlights, it looks like you shot this with an off-camera flash, maybe through an umbrella. Nonetheless, her eyes look a bit lifeless to me. They needed more light, either with fill at exposure or in post. I think the background is too bright for this period portrait. When I think of paintings, the backgrounds aren't this bright, so I would have reduced your ambient exposure and let your flash do the work. Also, remove the water holder from the rose. 11 points. Amalfi by Steve Sutton. The subject is the Amalfi Coast, well composed with dramatic light and sky. What's going on with the lower right corner where the water is suddenly blurred? 11 points and honorable mention. Hope by Rachel Cook. This is a lovely portrait of a lovely woman. I like the leading lines and where she's placed in the frame. The most important aspect of a portrait, in my opinion, is the rendition of the eyes. They need to be tack sharp. They aren't in this image. It looks like you applied some smoothing or softening effects in post. No one has skin this perfect. And I think it may be a little overdone, particularly on the left side of her face, which looks quite flat. Some of that is probably due to the lighting as well, since there's no shadow to add dimension. The other thing I'd like to see is her right shoulder drop down a bit. 11 points and 3rd place. Foiled by Richard Stern. The subject, this little girl's delight, engages the viewer. Technically, the focus, color rendition are beautiful. Was this shot with a Leica? Not exactly sure what is on the left side of the image. I'm going to guess a hand holding a sword? Presumably this is what she's reacting to, but it's hard to tell. I would have either included more of it so that it was clear, or excluded it as it is distracting as it is. 12 points and second place. Winter's Beauty at Moab, Utah by Gary Coles. Beautiful subject and light. I love the layering of the subjects, which draws me into the image as if it were 3D. I think some of the highlights could be recovered. I wish the log at the bottom wasn't cut off, as it is a major subject. Also, the little bit of horizon that is visible is way off level. I wonder what this would look like with a slightly wider angle so we could see more of the leveled horizon to the right and all of the log. 14 points and first place. Masters Color Prints. Pedaling Along a New Delhi Street by Rumberger. Interesting subject. There are blown highlights and lots of blur. Not talking about the wheels, which are fine, but the subjects themselves. 8 points. Hindu Carpet Maker in Jaipur, India by Janie Rumberger. Interesting subject. Good use of motion blur in her hands. The woman's face, her hair, it's all a hot mess of blur and artifact. The colors in her sari are all blocked up. 8 points. Sunflower by Betty Johnson. The sharpness of the detail and the depth of the color are strong. I'd like to see something more original. 10 points. Spring by Suzanne Graham. Well composed, good depth of field. The flowers need some more light on them. 10 points. Post by Bill Hayes. A lot of elements to engage the viewer's attention. Generally well composed. The hands are among the most expressive and interesting part of the human. I'd prefer to see them rather than cut the hands off at the wrist. 11 points. Small Town Liberty by Dan Meredith. Fun image from a small town. Lovely evening light. I would crop this image just above the lane stripe at the Lady Liberty's elbow. That makes it a cleaner composition in my opinion. 11 points. Urban Twilight by Gary Kelly. Pretty good perspective correction. Well composed and interesting light. Lots of digital noise in the clouds that I think could have been toned down, but that's a matter of taste. 11 points. Yellow Flyer by Kay Hargis. Great use of primary colors. For me, this portion of the plane with all the struts and braces makes for a busy composition. I wonder how it would look had the image included the nose of the plane instead. 11 points. Onions and Wood Bowl by Waylon Threadgill. Exquisite lighting, exposure, and detail. My eye just wanders around the image looking for a focus though. The composition needs an anchor. 11 points. Manly Peak by Bob Johnson. The way the layers and colors are compressed together, it almost looks like a tapestry. I would like a little more saturation and clarity. 12 points. Mining Back Bridge Maker by Stephen Reeves. Normally not a fan of a photograph of art as art, but this image really tells a story. The composition is great and the creamy bokeh is wonderful. Was this shot with a 200mm f2? The statue looks very slightly out of focus. 13 points and judge's choice. Half Dome at Sunset by Frank Richards. What beautiful color. The image looks a little over-processed with some artifacts in the grasses and bushes in the middle of the image. 13 points and honorable mention. Entrapment by Houston Brown. Obviously a lot of creative energy went into this image and a lot of technical effort. At the right end of Woodall Rogers, the roadway is broken, a stitch artifact I assume. I wish the reflections from the window frames weren't there. 14 points and third place. Sierra Sunset by Steve Newman. I love the depth from the grass in the foreground to the mountains in the rear, and the light, yummy. Doesn't look quite level to me, maybe light in the mountains just a bit. 14 points and second place. Throne of Pinnacles by Dennis Fritchie. Great composition, the contrast of light and shadows, rock and cloud are strong. 15 points and first place.